old regular hand, David Sims, retired Lieutenant Colonel from the United States Army, and also a new guest, Matthew Shoemaker. And Matt, you're probably gonna look familiar to some people if they watch television, so I'm gonna let you introduce your background in military terms and also reporting on it or commenting on the war so that people understand. People understand where you're coming from. So welcome to the podcast and tell us about yourself, Matt.
Sure. Thank you guys both for having me on. So I'm actually a former intelligence officer with the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is the Pentagon's version of the CIA, if you will. I spent a number of years stationed all around the country and overseas. I was primarily focused on the European problem set. I was stationed over in England with European Command for a number of years on the Russia desk over there. So I focused most of my intelligence work there, and prior to that, I did my doctoral coursework at King's College in London, focusing on nuclear war strategy, and then prior to that, I did my bachelor's at George Washington University in DC and my master's at Mount St. Mary's in beautiful Emmitsburg, Maryland.
Okay, so this is interesting. Nuclear war theory. That's going to be that should give us a topic here as we're in. I wouldn't call it a lull, but let's call it a bit of a transition period in the war.
Sure.
Well, Matt, let's start with you. What have you seen in the last week? I wanted to just run through about the last week. We do this every Thursday. What's been going on the battlefield from your perspective, and what is the let's call it state of play, for lack of a better word, in terms of what's going on across Ukraine?
Sure. Well, in the past week, as you kind of alluded to, it seemed to be a regrouping effort on both sides, on the Russian side and the Ukrainian side. In particular, the Ukrainians would have been focused on getting as much weaponry as possible into their hands, and to try and move their troops from the northern portion of Ukraine into the eastern sections to try and hold the line, if you will. To hold the line against the Russian push, if you will. In the past 24 hours in particular, there are certainly reports that Mariupol, for all practical purposes, have fallen to the Russians. From a big picture perspective, it's certainly going to be a morale hit to the Ukrainians, but it's at least tactically speaking, not going to amount to too terribly much. This was kind of a foregone conclusion, since the cavalry wasn't going to be coming over the hill to save the Ukrainian troops in Mariupol. So I think that's certainly one reason why in the past 24 hours, the Ukrainian government has announced that they're going to focus on destroying the Kerch Strait Bridge, which is the bridge that links Crimea with mainland Russia. So by the Ukrainians declaring that they're going to focus on destroying that, they are certainly drawing attention away to the fact that Mariupol, for all practical purposes, has now fallen. But at the same time, though, too, they're also essentially goading the Russians to move troops from the southern portion of Ukraine to try and bolster the defenses of the Kerch Bridge itself, which, whether or not the Ukrainians actually do end up attacking the Kerch Bridge, it is nonetheless a brilliant move. It should, in theory, move troops from the southern portion of Ukraine into the Crimean area. And if the Ukrainians don't attack it, then more power to them. It certainly helped weaken the defenses, or weaken the forces of the Russians at the very least. So I think in the past week itself, that's kind of what we're looking at the moment. I haven't seen any Russian movements through the Ukrainian line of defense. They really haven't been able to push through it, which is certainly good news for the Ukrainians, but the Russians are certainly trying at this point.
Let's go through those points one by one there. First of all, Mariupol has fallen because Putin, dramatic staged event where he's getting an update from Secretary or Minister Shoigu saying, hey, we've got the entire Azovstal steel plant surrounded. There's 2,000 fighters in there, plus I guess at least 1,000 civilians. And Putin sitting there nodding, clutching his desk like he's about to throw the desk somewhere. And then at the end of it, he says, no, I command you not to storm the factory, because we want to be very sparing with the lives of our men, which is great. I'm glad they finally came to that conclusion 58 days into the war, as if that order hadn't been given or that sentiment wasn't communicated properly. He seems to be showing some extreme sensitivity now. But really, Mariupol has not fallen, because they've just decided, well, if we go into the steel factory, it's going to be an absolute bloodbath, because these guys are not surrendering. They've still been destroying tanks through the last week. We've seen multiple videos of that. So I'm gonna take issue with the fact that saying it's fallen, because I think that's a Putin talking point. Let's talk about.
I think you're right. I think it kind of depends on how you're defining fallen, and the reason why I characterize it as such is with so many fighters largely focused in the bunker itself. There's not really too terribly much they can do with regards to the defense of the city. There, as you mentioned, they can certainly do one-off sort of attacking tanks and such, but for the rest of the city itself, I mean, it's largely fallen to the Russians.
Well, so this is why Putin, just because you say it doesn't mean it's so. He wants it to be so, that it's fallen, because he has the remnants of 12 battalion tactical groups in the city that are being tied down by this one garrison. Sure. And he wants to maybe rest and refit them, probably not, knowing the way they do things, probably just throw them straight up into the Donbass trench lines and try and effect a breakthrough. But this causes some real issues, because Dave, what happens? Let's bring you into this. What's going to happen if you don't? Well, first of all, it's a 5-kilometer square facility in an urban environment with underground tunnels. I would imagine that garrison can do some serious damage to troops that are left behind in the city. So you either have a cordon of a 5-kilometer, which you have to seal it off. Putin promised not to let a fly out, and you have to seal it off with, Dave, how many, like, what would be the force requirements to properly seal that off, knowing they also have a coastline too, which is probably how they're getting resupplied. Right. I know that this garrison is not just there surviving on fumes. They're getting resupplied every night somehow.
I think the closest thing you could recently compare it to would be Sadr City. Roughly same size. And if you look at the combat power, the United States committed to Sadr City in 2007, 2008, it was about 23,000 soldiers committed to clearing Sadr City. And it never got
clear. What about surrounding it?
Right. To surround it, it's going to take, a division. I'd say 10 to 12 BTGs just to surround the steel factory. Okay. Let me back that up. I'll take 7 to 8 because figuring the coastline, they're not going to put BTGs out in the water. That wouldn't work so well. But that opens up the question of how they do contain the maritime, right? It is the Sea of Azov. It's not the Black Sea. So it already has some natural containment to it, but it's like, as you noticed, it's still porous.
Yeah.
It's still getting through, and coastlines are really hard to contain. But regardless, you're looking at, U.S. British equivalent, 2 to 3 brigades worth of combat power just to cordon off the steel factory. And that just gets the surface. We're not even talking subsurface, like, as you mentioned. And you look at the Azov battalion, you look at the Marine Brigade that's in there. They know at this point, they know every square inch of that facility. They know super surface, surface, subsurface, routes in and out. They've rehearsed the routes in and out. They've rehearsed the routes to the coast. This is very well developed for them. So this is not an easy task. Should they ever decide to go in there and remove Ukrainian forces.
Well, Matt, what would you say as an intelligence officer who also makes these estimates? How many battalions do you think is required to actually, as Putin promised, because we know he does everything he says he promises on these things, to seal it off, so that not a fly can get.
That's short answer is that's a difficult question to answer, simply because the current makeup of Russian battalions themselves, especially in the area, is just to get a firm grasp on what those battalions look like is very difficult. And arguably, even the Russian Ministry of Defense doesn't have a 100% accurate picture on what those battalions look like, because on paper, a lot of those battalions from their commanders were either 80 to 100% full, when in reality, some intelligence or some news reports that I've seen had mentioned that they were only like 50% full, and that was before fighting actually even began. So just putting a number on it itself is going to be kind of difficult to do.
Let's go full strength or 80% strength Russian battalion. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt that they're not lying. They took no casualties.
Yeah, which is always that's always a dangerous thing to do. Yeah.
Really good battalions.
Yeah. If I had to go out on a limb and say that, I'd probably say 12 to 14 at the very least. The facility itself is massive, as you mentioned, and then you're also getting involved of what do you need to even hold the city itself with the population that's in there and those who are going to be conducting sabotage attacks. So I would probably say, at least 12 to 14, 100%. These are fresh guys, kind of thing. I mean, this is certainly a difficult thing. But at the same time, though, too, I mean, a certain majority of the city seems to have be in Russian control outside of the bunker itself.
Oh no, and that is clear. In fact, there was an operation yesterday where with armored vehicles, incredibly, the Marines or Azov broke out and rescued or linked up with another 500 border guards from the port of Mariupol and brought them back in. So this is like the American Alamo forming, where we're going to have, I mean, it's already legendary, I think, in military history lore, but I don't think the Mariupol story is finished by a long shot. Those guys are, not only they haven't surrendered and Putin's just decided to seal it off like it's just some bad medical case that your hope's going to go away, but they're still posting on social media every day. And the morale boost that me, as not even a Ukrainian, and this is my home, that's where my fiance and I live, we want to go back to, it's huge just to see that these guys are doing that, and the stories that are going to come out of this, the legends that are going to be, I think, told for generations because of this are powerful. And for Putin just to say, well, we've surrounded it and that's an easy thing, as if, well, why didn't you do that before? So I think what's going to happen. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Well, it certainly seems like his strategy, if you will, at the moment is there's a certain amount of hope involved in it. At the very least, I think he's hoping that he can starve them out. I think whether he's actually being fed the appropriate information, or if his own military leadership is feeding him this notion that they do have it surrounded and they have everything cut off. In under those circumstances, I think I can see him thinking that the best way of doing this is simply to starve them out if he genuinely believes that they don't have a means of resupplying themselves.
And just let's split the middle. Let's be really generous. That might take 8 to 12 battalion tactical groups that actually have real manning to seal that off from just the land side. And knowing the way the Russians are operating, and probably the reason why they wanted to declare victory, they're probably going to leave I would say 3 or 4 battalions, maybe, back there to try and pull this off.
Yeah, that's what I've seen with regards to reports, is that generally they would probably want to leave at least 4 in the city itself once they have full control over it. And as you mentioned, I mean, these guys have been fighting there for 6 to 8 weeks at this point. I mean, these guys are exhausted. So for them to be moved to another portion of the country to continue, the push forward, it's highly unlikely. Let's put it that way.
So I want to speculate a little bit here, Dave, because we have the ability to do that, freedom to do that here. What do you think's gonna? You really can't hold a city where you've just left a garrison of 2,500 people and you're not even going to seal off the area they're in properly. What do you think's going to happen here?
Well, if you just look at the operation that the Ukrainians just conducted yesterday, a tremendous operation. They broke out of their compound in the steel factory with significant force, with significant capability, over a river, through the city, into the harbor, right? Rescued 500 people, came right back through Russian-controlled terrain, infiltrated back into the steel factory. This is not a simple operation, and it's over supposedly contested terrain, right? And we don't know, quite the peculiars of what happened from SP to, hitting back to the release point. But just looking, at the terrain, it's difficult terrain regardless to go out and then back in. And if it's really Russian controlled, they should have been under contact the entire time. And they really weren't, at least from what we can tell. So what is Russia's level of real control there right now? It doesn't seem they're there, but it's still very porous, and it's still a relatively permissive environment that the Marine Brigade and Azov are able to execute missions, combat operations, albeit of probably a very limited scope. But if you leave a skeleton garrison of 4 to 5 BTGs of questionable quality, manning, equipment, and sustainment, that you don't really own that city. I don't think they really own it now. They think they do. And a lot of armies would think that they control that city, right? How many times over the past 20 years did the Americans or the Brits claim we controlled cities in Iraq or Afghanistan, and we don't. That's an incredibly difficult task, and everyone gets a vote in this train. The Russians and Ukrainians both get a vote, and the train is right now still permissive for Ukraine to operate in.
Yeah, I think you raise an interesting point there as well. This could really serve to be a deep thorn in Russia's side if Putin is under the impression that they do have this near total control of the city, when in reality he might not. In which case, if they end up moving troops out of the city and use them elsewhere, this could really backfire in Mr. Putin's face.
Yeah, that's kind of the note I took down there. Does Russian control of Mariupol really, does it truly allow Russia to reallocate combat power somewhere else?
Yeah.
Or are they just going to have to send that right back and try to take the city back? And it's like a never ending, cycle like Fallujah.
Yeah. Has Mariupol fallen? I don't think that's the case. Now, that's the Russian talking point, but until you clear out that garrison, I would say it's not fallen. Now, is that garrison under siege? For sure. Is 100%. Most of Mariupol in Russian hands? That seems to be clear, but that could well change unless they properly seal off the garrison, which means they really can't harvest any meaningful combat power from the city. They're just going to be sitting there occupying. And to your point, Matthew, and this is where you brought up the Kerch Bridge too, the hardest duty to do from a discipline morale standpoint is what, Dave? Guard duty.
Yep. Just manning a guard tower is the worst dang thing you can possibly ever do in the military.
Yeah. So okay, let's put up the barricades around the Azovstal steel factory. That's the hardest thing to get right. And what you need is soldiers to show up, stay awake, not get distracted, not fall asleep, not do all the things that badly disciplined soldiers do. I think this is just a disaster in the making if they truly, well, it's a tough choice. Either keep all your combat power in there and derive none of the benefit, and the only gain there is not as many casualties on your side going in to clear people out. So that's what option A. Option B is say it's clear and it really isn't, and leave a festering sore in the middle of Mariupol that could be regenerated. So I don't know what's going to happen. It'll be interesting to watch, and that's something everyone should watch for in the next week, is how many battalion tactical groups are moved out of Mariupol, if any. And if you don't see any, which they're starting to say they are going to be moved out or are on the way, if you don't see any, then they're doing the right thing, which is sealing off this festering wound, or they're taking a huge amount of risk and leaving a festering wound and moving some troops out into other places. So that's what I'll be looking for on that.
So it's a bigger city than Ramadi.
Yeah.
It's about twice the population of Ramadi. And Ramadi was a heck of a thorn in the American side that ended up a division plus worth of combat powers committed to that city, in 2005, 6, 7. And that's American, Marine Corps augmented by U.S. Army combat power for a city half that size.
Mm-hmm. I think for American comparison, I believe the size of Mariupol is roughly around the size of Long Beach, California, as well.
That's quite a
yeah. It's right about 500,000 people.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So next point I'd like to bring up on this show, Matt, and this is, I think, a really good summary of what's happened so far, is prominent Russian, let's call him soldier of fortune, Igor Girkin. Have you heard of him, Matt?
I have, yes.
Okay. Well, tell us what you know about him, because I want to read some of his scathing commentary about his own country's military performance with you and Dave.
Well, I mean, in all honesty, he's most likely a war criminal himself. He was the Minister of Defense, if you will, for the Donetsk People's Republic in the Donetsk region. Not terribly long, though, from my understanding. He was only there for a couple months. But, I mean, he is a Russian nationalist, to say the least. Let's put it that way.
He's a Russian nationalist who came to Ukraine right after the illegal annexation of Crimea and started stirring up fighting in eastern Ukraine and basically took the lead in that. And I guess he left after a certain period in frustration with Russia not doing enough. He's a big history buff of Russian military history, very well read. Actually enjoyed reading his commentary because of his copious analogies to the Second World War. And I want to go over what he said, which I think really frames where we are strategically. And this is where, Matt, I think your background as an intelligence officer, but also as a nuclear war theorist or scholar, I guess, I'd like to see, because we're really getting into game theory here now with what's going on. And Igor Girkin is one of the few people, I guess, who can get away with openly criticizing on whatever social media channels the Russian special military operation, otherwise known as a war. And he said, one of my comrades who came back from the front line for reorganization asked to briefly and clearly sum up and express my thoughts that I listed in discussion with him, revolving around my pessimism towards the success of the second stage of the special military operation. He believes someone might find this useful. I think that no one from those making decisions will pay any attention, but I made a promise, so here it is. So he said, first, from our side, after the successful completion of the stage of the operation, which ended with a large-scale retreat from Kyiv, Chernihiv, and Sumy, a relocation and concentration of the forces in the Donetsk region of the front line has occurred. Most likely, and according to the official statements of the political command and Russian forces, this is precisely where they are planning to conduct the second stage and complete the objective of totally clearing the territories of Lugansk, Donetsk People's Republic of the enemy's formations. Obviously, they count on creating 2 to 3 offensive groups with enough manpower, which when concentrated with all available aviation and majority of artillery forces will break through the Ukrainian forces, which are still, for some reason, not appreciated highly enough, and destroy them in one battle. From the Ukrainian armed forces side, the plans of Russian forces are very clear to them, and they do not at all consider this defeat inevitable. In fact, the opposite. The Ukrainian armed forces are planning to defend their highly fortified positions, relying on old and newly created, Russian armed forces gave them plenty of time for that, positions at assumed directions of Russian forces strikes, which are obvious. Just look at the map. Let's ask a question. Can the supremacy of Russian armed forces in aviation and heavy weaponry guarantee a victory over the enemy, for whom the offensive plans are obvious, who's in prepared defense? And he basically goes on to say they can't do it. They don't have enough combat power. It's about even on personnel on each side. The Pentagon today just briefed that there's more tanks on the Ukrainian side now due to arms deliveries and tanks on the Ukrainian side than the Russian side. So this is tank country. Boom, all of a sudden Ukrainians have more tanks, and now the heavy artillery is getting poured across the border by the United States, and now all other NATO countries are pouring that across. It basically seems, according to his analysis, he basically said, look, we either go deep, we try and envelop the entire, we go all the way to the Dnipro River, meet it from the north and south at the Dnipro. But he said, look, given our force structure and the way the Ukrainians have been fighting the fortified positions, we basically can't do it. And he said, they've been mobilizing since February 24th. He said in the summer, they're going to bring in divisions, like mobilized divisions with all this new equipment. He said, "What? A couple more divisions into the fight." It's really a very interesting position, because the race to mobilize is being won by Ukraine. The weapons are, Ukraine's getting more weapons now than Russia in terms of replacements. All of a sudden, the battle of attrition is not only manpower-wise, but starting to be material-wise in favor of Ukrainian forces. So I just wanted to get your commentary and thoughts on that, Matthew, and what are Putin's options here? I mean, what can he do to get out of this, or is his only option left, as Igor is calling for, full mobilization, which, even if he does it, is going to take time?
Yeah, a lot of stuff to talk about in that. I think just right off the bat, I want to at least mention that I'm always a little leery of being a little bit too numbers focused when it comes to equipment and tanks and things like that. A great example is simply because, when this started, the Russians had, gobs of tanks and they had all of the heavy weapons that they needed, what they thought they needed at least, but it proved not to be enough. They weren't really trained very well on that equipment, and they allowed the Ukrainians to take advantage of their weakness. So I think that, yes, it's good, certainly good news that the Ukrainians now have more tanks than the Russians do. Hopefully they're able to use them better than the Russians certainly were. But I think that's one of the components that we're going to have to wait and see going forward. Of, yes, the Ukrainians now have these, but are they sophisticated enough? Are they well trained enough on them? No matter what type of tanks they are they well trained enough to actually use them effectively? I think if I were to speculate, I think that they probably will be able to use them effectively. But you know, this is a little bit of a wait and see kind of moment. I think big picture wise, the way that these things are going is that it certainly favors the Ukrainians. But I certainly think that the Ukrainians, if stuff starts going wrong, they could still lose this. Which is why, yeah, they can still lose this. So I think they really need to keep their head in it. They've done a phenomenal job so far to do that. Now, when it comes to what Putin is going to do, if it's going to require full mobilization, for example, in order to achieve just the pure numbers sort of dominance that the Russians think that they need, I'm skeptical if Mr. Putin is willing to go that far. I think in order to do that, I think the situation would have to become far more dire in the way that they're characterizing it to the Russian population. And I think there have to be a few more steps before we get there. From the reports that I've seen coming out of Russia with regards to the support for this, as they call it, the special military operation, the young people in general are the ones who are least likely to support the invasion of Ukraine. The young people are also the ones who are most likely to go and fight and die in the invasion of Ukraine. The real support, allegedly at least. Yeah, I know, right? That tends to happen.
Old people sending young people to war. Yeah.
I mean, there was just a report, I think, in the past day or so it was coming out of the Times of London that a Russian mother was on the phone with her soldier son, telling him to kill women and children because they're not actually women and children, they're actually Nazis, sort of thing. And so you're seeing that more from the older population. They get most of their news from state-controlled media, unlike the younger generation, which tends to get it through other sources. But the older population also is the one who seems at least to be the most supportive of this. So I think in order to get the young people to be willing enough to be conscripted and to send their conscripts over to Ukraine for this, I think a few more steps needs to happen before we get there.
Well, it sounds like what they need is a good old defeat on the battlefield in the Battle of Donbass to provide that kind of, let's call it, and I think a lot of people misjudge how countries react in these situations, especially Russia, which has always had a siege mentality. And the deaths perversely have a negative effect on your willingness to quit, because parents are saying, and I saw this in Iraq, and we saw this, Dave, multiple times. If we're going to pull out of Iraq and Afghanistan, what were the sacrifices of my friends for? If we do not win this war, what was my son's death for? And you're actually starting to see more and more pressure from the casualty figures to win. And then there can be a breaking point where all of a sudden you just say, forget this, no more. So there's this like curve that goes up, and then it can break at a certain point. And we don't know how close Russian society is to that breaking point. Putin's regime, his internal security services, which aren't very happy because Putin's arresting over 150 senior FSB officers from the Fifth Service have been arrested. So you think it needs another setback, or just more propaganda preparation on the part of the government, or what do you think it needs for them to get to the point of full mobilization or partial mobilization?
I think one of the major things that's going to have to happen first is on the propaganda side, because the way that it's being portrayed in the Russian media, generally speaking, is that they are winning. They're characterizing it as they're fighting NATO, they're fighting the United States, they're fighting Britain in particular. They're not really fighting the Ukrainians, but nonetheless, they are still, as they're characterizing it, the way that they're portraying is that they are still winning. So in order for them to do a full mobilization, they would have to start changing the way that they're describing it to, we are now, we the homeland is threatened. This is a bigger battle. We need more your sacrifice for it. At the moment, I have not seen them characterizing it as such.
So do you watch Russian media yourself, or are these your summaries that you get from it from the intelligence sources?
So number one, I am not divulging any intelligence in this discussion whatsoever. This is all from media reports that I've seen myself.
No, I'm not.
So
I'm not
just full disclosure about that one.
No, I'm talking about open source intelligence. But
So
where's your knowledge of Russian media? Is that just secondhand, or do you know the language and watch it yourself?
So I know enough a little bit to be dangerous. I'm not confident enough to be able to speak fluently. But so I'm usually using like a translator, or I'll send it to someone who has a better grasp on it. So those kinds of things.
And that's interesting, because if the Russian media does not portray things as going poorly, they tried to cover up Moscow, which is not going well. They're obviously saying Mariupol has fallen, which is patently not true, but they can say that on a technicality if they're surrounding a garrison that they think is surrounded, which probably isn't. And now they're saying we're going to liberate Donetsk and Lugansk and create this, which was the original war aims. Brilliant. What do you think? So you think it's mainly the propaganda has to be laid, or do you think they're just going to need a defeat that they just can't hide, that they need to turn around and spin into something else? What do you think?
That's it kind of would depend on the circumstances. It wouldn't surprise me, in order to utilize the propaganda side of things, that they lay some sort of false flag, whether it be some sort of chemical attack or whatnot. It's what the defeat would look like exactly on the battlefield. I'm a little bit hard pressed to come up with an example that would drive them to then supply to switch to a full mobilization side of things. I think perhaps one possibility is if the Russians, for example, started attacking areas in Crimea, that might possibly.
You mean Ukrainians? If the Ukrainians,
if the Ukrainians would attack very, like Sevastopol, for example, or some areas in mainland Russia, that I think that's where we would start to see some more a switch in propaganda, at least. Even if the Russian, let's say, for example, the Russians get surrounded, if you will, in the Donbass region, I'm not sure that the Kremlin would be willing to broadcast that to the Russian people, that because that becomes very dangerous for the Russian government's own stability and its own legitimacy. So it kind of really depends on what the circumstances of that looks like.
Okay. Well, so if you think mobilization is not there yet and it endangers the regime, which I would agree. I think mobilization is basically an admission of failure on the battlefield, or a long war is ahead, which could cause some serious problems inside not just society. I think the greatest threat to Putin, we'd all agree, is revolution from above, a palace coup. There's some hard to hide tensions between himself and a lot of his former close advisors and FSB members. But Russia has a doctrine, and this is what I want to get into with you: escalate to de-escalate. And
yes,
there's a lot of articles out there about tactical nukes and what is their use on the battlefield, what is their use in war, and most importantly, what would that mean for the world, and specifically what would the U.S. and NATO, if anything, do about it?
Yeah. Okay. So those are great questions, and this is really my bread and butter kind of stuff. So the phrase "escalate to de-escalate" itself, there is at the very least an academic debate about whether or not that is even Russian doctrine. So the phrase "escalate to de-escalate" comes from a House Armed Services Committee hearing back in about 2015, I believe it was, where the deputy Secretary of Defense was asked what the Russian Gerasimov doctrine was, and Gerasimov himself is the equivalent of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for the Russians. The Gerasimov doctrine was a speech that Gerasimov gave about back in about 2012, 2013, in which Gerasimov was describing what he thought American policy was for the Arab Spring. He probably didn't even write the speech himself, in all honesty, but his speech then got pulled into what the Americans described what the Russian policy was, even though Gerasimov was describing American policy. And it kind of just spiraled into this sort of thing where now I believe it was the 2018 nuclear defense review, the Americans claim that the Russian policy is escalate to de-escalate. Now, so that's the academic side.
That's not a thing. That's a so escalate to de-escalate is not an official Russian doctrine as you just described it. Then,
correct. Yeah, it is a giant game of telephone. In all honesty, and so that's why. But at the same time, though, all militaries, from a strategic perspective, attempt to get the other side to push away from the table at some point, and that's essentially what the policy is attempting to describe. But the reason why this game of telephone happened was because the Deputy Secretary of Defense was asked to briefly summarize the Gerasimov doctrine, and he said it's escalate to de-escalate. It was a quick, easy, kind of sexy way of describing it. It's not a very good way of describing it either, because it implies that the Russians are willing to use nuclear weapons first, and the Russians have been on both sides of that topic. They do not agree with themselves if they're willing to use nuclear weapons first. So it's a very convoluted way of describing Russian policy. But having said that, when it comes to the actual use of nuclear weapons and tactical nukes, as you asked about them, the Russians have very small yield nuclear weapons that could be in the range of half a kiloton of destructive power, which for reference, the American nuclear bomb that went off in Hiroshima was about 15 kilotons. So we're talking very small nuclear weapons. It will probably, if it were to go off in the center of Kyiv, for example, a half a kiloton nuclear bomb would probably destroy about maybe 3 blocks worth of area. It's not terribly large on nuclear weapons, from a nuclear weapons perspective, and the radiation from half a kiloton is not going to be traveling too terribly far either. So that becomes then, if you will, if you take it a step further, it becomes more of a temptation for the Russians to use that, because it's so tiny that it could be masked as just a very large conventional bomb. It would take some additional time for the Americans or for the West to verify that it was a nuclear weapon, for example. And once that it's been determined, it's between 3 and 5 days, let's say, sort of thing. And so time goes on, and it becomes a way for the Russians to kind of breach that step of using nuclear weapons, but it's so small. Are the Americans, since they don't have any equivalent of nuclear weapons that small, are the Americans willing to respond in kind with nuclear weapons, which would be far larger? So it becomes a game of deterrence, if you will.
And where would you speculate, knowing what you know about Russian doctrine, or what is out there that actually is real versus how we describe it? Do you think that Russia would use nuclear weapons on the battlefield as an effective tool to try and change what's going on the battlefield, or do you think they would use it more as a terror weapon in, let's say, some small city to just make a statement, or even out in the middle of nowhere to make a statement that this can go to a city next, or the next city could be Kiev? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, and just for perspective, to make things extra complicated, you can accomplish more than one thing at once, especially with regards to nuclear weapons. You can send a message, and you can also take out a military target, for example. One of the reasons why the use of nuclear weapons is such a why it's listed as an unconventional weapon is because it's largely a political. The decision to use nuclear weapons is a political decision. It's very rarely a purely military option, because the way that most militaries are nowadays, most military targets can be destroyed with conventional weapons of one sort or another, even if you have to use multiple ones at the same time. So the use of nuclear weapons and the message that it sends is largely a political one as well. So I think that is really going to come down to what does Mr. Putin want to, what kind of message does he want to send? I think that's really what it's going to come down to. The Russians have what they call red lines, in terms of their nuclear doctrine of what will it take for the Russians to use nuclear weapons. So, for example, if the West were to attack Kaliningrad, the little enclave of Russian territory between Poland, Belarus, and the Baltic countries, that would be what they consider a red line, and that would be a circumstance under which they would use nuclear weapons. And a second one would be if their forces were degraded to such an extent that they can no longer provide a viable defense for the Russian homeland. That's a very murky and gray area, and it really comes down to what is the Russian government willing to do. So the answer to that, to your question, is it's complicated. He probably, if he were backed into a corner, he could very well use. I think it would start off with very small yield nuclear weapons in order to send that message, and then they would go from there.
Yeah. So that's a very, very real possibility, especially in face of a battlefield defeat. Then,
if the Kremlin views the battlefield defeat as being so detrimental to its forces and to the Russian homeland protection that their destruction now, essentially, they have the way that the Russians would view it is that they have no other viable option to protect themselves other than to use nuclear weapons. I don't think we're there yet at this point. But it is, when you're talking about a country with a lot of nuclear weapons and with a very high tolerance for losses and for the loss of life, it is certainly something that has to be taken into, your own calculations.
And as I understand it, militarily, it's probably not that useful given the nature of the Ukrainian forces being spread out and dispersed on the front line and probably very close to the Russian forces on the front. And it would probably be something that would be more used on a city or some larger fixed target that obviously you can't move or disperse.
That would be the more likely situation, but at the same time, though, too, the Kremlin has shown that it doesn't really mind if a few Russians get in the way of it going off. If they're too close to the explosion, I mean, they get incinerated, and then what proof is there that the Russians were even there, kind of thing. So it's certainly a very sad and very disheartening sort of situation when you as a Russian soldier are in the mindset that your own country will be essentially willing to blow you up like that.
Yeah. And Dave, I just wanted to bring you in on this as a tactical commander in the battlefield. How does this impact, if anything, their calculations?
Yeah. As a couple old cavalrymen, Sam, we remember probably getting smacked across the wrist for giving the old die in place mission, to your scouts, right? Where you don't have an exfil plan for them, right? They're gonna sit out there on an island alone and unafraid, and continue to report on the enemy's movements and composition, disposition, and eventually you're just going to lose contact with them because the enemy's going to kill them. man, what an awful way to command your forces by giving them the die in place mission. It's for us, it's unacceptable to give that kind of task and purpose to a subordinate unit, and just knowing, well, the soldiers don't know. Russian soldiers don't know that's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
They don't know that is acceptable. Yeah. So the effect there, negligible at the pointy tip of the spear for Russians, but operational and strategic level commanders in the Russian military and their high level civilian leadership knows that they're willing to make this sacrifice on behalf of the motherland. And it's just it's a different mindset. And that's something that's a recurring theme we've had, right? Is, you know, the Russian mindset is not Western, it's not Asian, it is distinctly Russian.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very hard to understand if you're not from that culture and that mindset.
Well, Matt, this is a question I wanted to ask it to you. Is the U.S. response is, I think, intentionally unclear, because one of the big mistakes we've made, I think, and I think a lot of people agree on this, is taking everything off the table before we need to. The Biden administration did a brilliant job saying this invasion was coming and a horrible job saying we're not going to do anything about it militarily, because even if that's never the intention, I think it's much better to have that ability than to, take it off the table, keep people guessing. I think they're starting to get more cagey on that, because on the chemical weapons front, President Biden said, we will respond in kind. This could be from finally cutting off all Russian oil and gas. I think morally, the Russians need to understand that economically they're really done if they start crossing some of these red lines on well, I'm not going to call it red lines on our side because we don't seem to have any, but if they start crossing the Rubicon with chemical and nuclear, they're basically becoming even more of a pariah than they already are. I think it's hard for a lot of the world to stay neutral, or at least openly stay neutral in that case. And they could well have, maybe if it's not the United States, it's Britain that just pops up and lobs a nuke themselves or something to send a message, and they're a NATO member, which obviously creates the Article 5 treaty if Britain gets hit or threatened by Russia. So where do you think the countermeasures go, and what's the right policy? This is impossible to say, but where do you think the thinking is at on our side?
Yeah, I'll say very quickly, at least, that I think you're 100% right that one of the things we certainly got right from an intelligence perspective was, sounding the alarm that this was going to happen. One of the things I think we got wrong was the view of the Russian ability and their ability to take on Ukraine. I think that it's fairly clear that even our own understanding of Ukraine's ability to defend itself was not accurate either. So I think those two inaccurate conclusions that we drew from an intelligence perspective on their each respective capabilities, I think that really hampered us at the very beginning from moving more weapons into Ukraine. I think that's one reason we didn't, because I think in the American government, they assumed that Ukraine would fall fairly quickly. In the first couple days of the war, President Zelensky was offered a way out, and he famously said, I need ammo, not a ride, for example. So I think that from that perspective, that kind of hampered us to begin with. I think now we are getting, we are doing a far better job moving weapons and equipment into Ukraine to help them defend themselves. The policy in DC, though, at the moment seems to be coming out of the White House of let the Ukrainians bleed the Russians until the Russians themselves choose to move out. That seems to be what the plan is at the moment. They're, you know, they have been fairly successful. At least the White House has been fairly accurate in that assessment. That, you know, the Ukrainians were able to get the Russians out of the Kyiv region. We'll see if they're able to do it out of the eastern portion of Ukraine. They're doing a great job so far, and they need the heavier weapons to actually physically push the Russians out at this point.
So you don't see the Americans doing anything in response, or NATO, or you think it's deliberately ambiguous on a response to a tactical nuke?
So if the Russians were to use nuclear weapons, then it really is kind of a brave new world at that point, since there haven't been the usage of nuclear weapons in a live combat area since the Second World War. So especially since the Russians have very tiny nuclear weapons, I think what would probably happen, at least initially, is we would see a cutoff of SWIFT, for example, for the Russians, and I think that NATO in particular and the European Union would shut down as much trade as possible, including the Russian the importation of Russian energy into the EU. It really would not be tenable at that point anymore for them to do that. So I think that's what would be the initial reaction, and whether or not, you know, nuclear weapons would be used in response, it goes back to my earlier response of it is a political decision at that point. And you know, the Biden White House has certainly been very reticent to get too terribly involved in these things. Boris Johnson over in the UK has been far more gung-ho, if you will. That goes back for historical reasons to a certain extent, since the Russians and the British have always kind of interfered in each other to a certain extent. But that's essentially what we're looking at if the Russians were to use nuclear weapons.
Dave, you had a couple more questions with the nuclear expert here. My question is, would the Russian officers or chain of command follow such an order? And or do you think this would increase the likelihood of a palace coup if for those who might not want to see World War III break out?
Yeah, if we're limiting ourselves to very small yield nuclear weapons, like a half a kiloton, as I mentioned earlier, I think that it would be more likely that the officers would follow it. I think the chance of a palace coup is less. I think what happens after that really is the question of how the West responds to it. If things continue to spiral after that, and it doesn't, if the West doesn't, let's say, push back from the table as the Russians intended them to, and it continues to escalate, if you will, I think then it becomes far more likely that the Russians on the ground start to disobey orders blatantly, especially with regards to the use of tactical nukes, and the chances of a palace coup increase substantially. If things were in a worst case scenario to go to a point of switching to strategic nuclear weapons, which are the big ICBMs that really only target Western cities, then the chain of command with regards to who's pushing the button is fairly limited in the Russian military. It really takes control out of most people's hands, and it would be difficult for the military themselves to disobey that order, if that makes sense.
It's hard for them to even not push the button in the strategic nukes.
So the Russians have a system called Dead Hand, or at least they did during the Soviet era. It's unclear if they still have it now. And Dead Hand essentially was a relatively automated way for the Russian nuclear response to happen if Moscow and the Russian high command were to be destroyed. That way, if Moscow is destroyed, then the plan was at least that a signal would go out for all of the ICBMs to launch themselves. So it's unclear if they still have that, but that was at least the policy during the Soviet era. So it really takes the decision making out of lower level echelons, which, in all honesty, has been part and parcel with the Russian military structure from day one. Most military decisions are made at a very high level.
And we're seeing the effects of that now. And then last question, Dave, you had. I'll let you ask your question.
Yeah. If we look at the maintenance and sustainment capabilities of their conventional forces, that's an indictment on Russia, right?
Yeah.
on their military capability. Yeah. What do we know about the maintenance readiness of their nuclear force?
So that is the question. I mean, everyone in the West is asking that question. And the short answer is we don't know. The long answer is that when it comes to readiness, when it comes to the amount of money that the Russian government funnels into their nuclear weapons, and the amount of time that they spend training on them, it certainly suggests that they put a lot of stock in them, which under normal circumstances would mean that they have a high sense of readiness. But because of the amount of corruption in the Russian system, it really becomes an open question. Because
which generals have yachts? That's my question. Like, if you're in the nuclear forces, who pocketed all that money?
So because these people in the supply chain, these generals, they can sign paperwork that says, yes, this set of weapons have been updated, and instead of updating them, they just pocket the money and run with it. So they can, they do whatever they want with it, kind of thing. But at least on paper, at least they are updated and they are good to go. So, but as a way of summing things up, if you will, the Russians have a saying of paper will endure anything that you write on it. So, anything you put on paper, that's what it says. It doesn't necessarily mean it's true.
Well, I love that system of reporting. I wish it were that easy, Dave, when we were in the Army. So, but
don't trust anyone over 40, right?
Yeah. Well, Matthew, I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your insights on the way the war is going right now, and more importantly, some of the strategic questions around nuclear weapons. I think that's something I've been wanting to educate myself on, and I'm glad I just was able to ask someone who that's what you've studied. And Dave, as always, thanks for coming on. I actually think we identified something that might not have been so thought through yet or discussed, the nuances of the fall of Mariupol and what that really means, and the two bad choices I think Putin's left with, given their failure to take that garrison. But there's always a possibility Ukrainian forces may yet surrender, despite their insistence they won't. Everyone reaches a breaking point, and Zelensky said multiple times they've done their duty already, but they're heroically standing on still. I don't think the story's over yet, and I think we've been saying that for a while. So, but yeah, thanks both of you for coming on, and really appreciate your insights on this. And Matt, look forward to having you back, and especially if we know who to call if there's some bigger issues at play, and really look forward to talking to both of you again. And finally, if you're watching this show or this broadcast, this is brought to you by Borderlands Foundation, nonprofit supporting Ukrainians, helping them during and after the war recover. And we are about to release our app to help let people like you donate directly to Ukrainians in need, which is our main goal of our foundation, is help people remove the middleman. And if any of you would like to do that, just keep watching and watch for that release. And if you'd like to donate to the foundation also, which the team also produces this podcast, and please do so with the link below the show. So thanks everyone for joining. We'll see you